And I think we are now live. Let's check on YouTube and see how we're doing. Seeing, there we go. Welcome, everyone. I am joined here by my colleague, Alex Stopp. And for those who don't know me, my name is Colin Mortimer. I'm the director of the Center for New Liberalism here at the Progressive Policy Institute.
Hi, I'm the Director of Technology Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute.
So we just watched approximately, let's see, it started at 1. So I guess we watched 5.5 hours of hearings.
Yes, we had a 1 hour delay. We can't get things started on time. And then we had 5.5 hours of questions.
So if you're watching this and you didn't watch the hearings for some reason, today the House Subcommittee on Antitrust called Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, Google CEO Sundar Pichai?
Pichai, you nailed it.
Pichai, nice.
Greater than 50% of Congress members could not get it right. And they butchered it. And the poor guy just had to take it, but it was incredibly rude of you. You nailed it.
And then Apple CEO Tim Cook. What was your overall reaction from today?
I think it was about as expected, which was that there wasn't a lot of antitrust substance in the hearing. It oftentimes devolved into, let's talk about misinformation, election interference, talking about things that happened in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, Russians interfering in the presidential election back then, a lot about content moderation, like conservatives claiming they're being censored, Democrats bringing up that conservative content is extremely popular on social media, especially Facebook. So a lot of back and forth about things that aren't directly antitrust issues. Privacy is also not an antitrust issue per se, maybe indirectly related. But in terms of talking about consumer welfare, are these companies innovative? Are they producing great products and services? Or are they suppressing innovation? Are they using exclusionary or anti-competitive conduct to dominate these markets and to hold back economic growth or benefits for consumers? There wasn't a lot of discussion of that. I think Congresswoman Jayapal asked some of the smartest questions that were...
I was going to say that.
Yeah, I think she did a great job asking about data-related questions. So I think there's a fair debate to be had about these big platforms, the amount of data they have on consumers now, and they're so large. Does that give them an unfair competitive advantage? I argue often that it doesn't. I think the data's brick-and-mortar retailers like Walmart use data just like Amazon uses data. But it's a really fair question, and it goes to a question of competition that antitrust enforcers should look at and consider. And so she asked very pointed questions about news reports, about how Amazon's been using data, and Amazon's doing an internal investigation. But there's already evidence that probably an employee violated an internal rule about how they're using data to compete for Amazon's private label goods to compete with third-party sellers on their platform. And so those are the kind of questions that a quote-unquote antitrust hearing should focus on. But we had, I would say, 70 to 80% of the hearing was talking about censoring conservatives or political bias, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's surprising, especially coming from us, that I think some of the best questions came from Jayapal, who, even though we ideologically don't agree with, she was actually getting to the core of an issue of okay, this is an antitrust hearing. We're actually going to talk about antitrust.
Yeah.
Compared to a significant amount of the Republican representatives who spoke about conservative censorship.
Yeah.
We had a lot of really great bits from Jim Jordan talking about masks, talking about what else did he talk about? He really went off topic a lot.
Well, at one point, he started interrupting one of his colleagues when it wasn't his time to speak, and some people were telling him to be quiet, to put your mask back on. At that point, he said, "If you want to talk about unmasking, let's talk about the unmasking of Michael Flynn." And it's now turned into a Michael Flynn.
Is Michael Flynn an antitrust issue?
Not in my opinion, but what do I
know? And then, yeah, I mean, I think the Democrats got off topic when they talked about Cambridge Analytica. They come up a few times. You had a little bit about misinformation. They talked about how, Fox News and Ben Shapiro are really high up on Facebook's engagement metrics, which might be an issue based on their opinion, but it's not an antitrust issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's no reason a priori to believe that if we broke up Facebook or any other social media platform into pieces, that those pieces wouldn't also have the same policies or the same incentives to promote certain kinds of content, or the same kind of content moderation policies, what they allow and don't allow on their platforms. There's no reason to think that that's necessarily would be the case, and so it's a weird antitrust thing. It's a weird thing to focus on in an antitrust hearing. And the other one that you just reminded me of that I think there was bipartisan consensus, was that politicians would like to be able to send as much spam campaign email as possible and not have it filtered in your inbox at all. And so they brought it up. Both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, brought it up with Sundar Pichai saying, why are my emails going into the spam box? And that's a weird thing also to ask.
And if you're watching the stream, I imagine you maybe have gotten a campaign email once in your life. They're incredibly spammy.
Yeah, you mark it as spam like right off the bat.
Because there was the recent thing about the Trump campaign. They were sending off these texts about like they were tracking if you would open the text message or not, which is a thing you can do. Like if you do mail or text campaigns, like email or text campaigns, like you can see when people open it, and they do give you an option of replying or of sending it again to people who don't open it, which I have never done because that feels incredibly invasive to be like, hi, you didn't listen to me the first time, so I'm going to send you a second email and be like, if you don't donate now, we're going to lose the election. Which I guess I kind of blame the companies for giving that option as an available thing, but also like total mask off moment of like, hi, we spam people and we want to spam them more effectively. Why don't your platforms spam potential donors more effectively?
Exactly. I think that's just it's the case of this really is ironic. So I think the tech companies are not beyond criticism. There have been documented instances of both where I think both Google and Facebook have committed in their policies or in some kind of promise to users that they wouldn't use data in a certain way, and then the incentives for growth, and over time you might break that in a certain way. And so and they've been slapped on the wrist by the FTC. They paid fines for that. They've tried to adjust and improve their privacy policies and their data protection policies over time. And I think they're doing a better job. So they're not beyond criticism, but it's very ironic that they often get yelled at by politicians in hearings or in newspapers. Journalists yell at them. But like you mentioned, politicians use tons of data around their campaigns. They're very invasive. They do like a lot of the best targeting campaigns came from the one of the first Obama campaigns. They're very cutting edge with how they use data, and politicians to this day continue to use it. And newspapers, New York Times collects many different data attributes about you. They're looking to sell it to other parties. They're trying to get into that business, and they sell target ads as well. And so there's a lot of like both sides to this of that going on.
So let's break it down. By the way, we're going to have some guests coming on in a few minutes, but me and Alec are going to start off just to give a little bit more background. First guest is going to be Sam Bowman, who I think many viewers probably are familiar with. Break it down for me what specific antitrust infractions each company was accused of, because all four of them were basically accused of something different and to varying degrees of severity.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I wish more questions in the hearing have been posed in that nature of like, what is the antitrust issue we're trying to solve here? Because I think very few of them were, but I can bring in outside criticism from beyond the hearings of what generally people talk about when they talk about antitrust issues. So let's start with Google and Facebook. They're generally accused of unfairly dominating the digital advertising market. People talk about Facebook having a monopoly on social media, but they charge nothing to their users to use social media. You can define that market very broadly. Like TikTok is the most popular in terms of growth app on the market right now, and so hard to say that they're unbeatable or have a monopoly on in terms of your attention or how you connect or communicate with people. Just look at your phone. You use tons of apps to communicate with people. So antitrust enforcers will look on the monetized side of these businesses. So not on the free side to users, but they'll look at, okay, Facebook and Google make money on ads. What's happening in the ad market? Do they have too much market power there? And so that's where the investigations are focused, especially in terms of Google. If there's an antitrust case this year, it will be very likely in the advertising market. But then if you're, from my perspective, you have to just look at the numbers, and the DOJ publishes guidelines on these things. And so a monopolization case would require finding greater than 2/3 market share in the relevant market. And so for statistics for our listeners, Google has 29% of the U.S. digital advertising market. Facebook has 23%. And Amazon's actually been growing really rapidly in terms of ads. Like when you search for a product on Amazon, they'll show you an ad at the top usually. And they have 10% of the market. So hard to make a monopolization case when 3 of the CEOs testifying today have companies that compete vigorously in that market, not to mention non-tech companies. And then I'll just quickly pivot to Apple. Theirs is really focused on the App Store and smartphones. But again, Apple does not clear the 2/3 threshold in the United States. They have 58% of the U.S. smartphone operating system market. And so I think they also have a case of where they've not been super consistent with how they've enforced their App Store policies, and they can do a better job of that. And maybe someone needs to look into that in terms of how they're enforcing them. But in terms of like, are they abusing their market power? Do they have a monopoly? I think those questions are incorrect. And the 30% tax that they charge for paid apps is in line with the market. Almost every platform you can think of charges around that rate for their commission. And then I think Tim Cook mentioned this in his testimony that 84% of apps are free. And Apple collects no commission. So you have to consider that as well. And then real quick, lastly, Amazon in the e-commerce market. People think they're too dominant online. But even just in e-commerce, if you don't consider physical retail, if you don't consider that the Walmart store down the street competes with Amazon online, which I would argue they do, even just in e-commerce, Amazon only has 38% of the market. And that's including Amazon first-party retail sales and the whole Amazon marketplace, where it's third parties who are selling their own stuff, and Amazon gets a cut of that. So not close to the monopoly share you would need to show in the market. But those are the kind of questions that an antitrust enforcer would be asking. It would be a bigger bulk of the hearing if it were more about antitrust.
So then, I mean, I think one of the more defining moments from the hearing is the hearings immediately end, and Representative David Cicilline says, we all know these guys are monopolists, which, again, like, what's the point of having a hearing if you already went in with this preconceived notion that they're monopolists?
Yeah, that statement was pre-written. Like, it wasn't like I learned it. He said, I learned the statement. It's like, no, you didn't. You had that written.
You had this. Your aide wrote that before you got up there. So what is Congress proposing here? Are they saying that under current antitrust laws that they're going to prosecute these companies or attempt to break them up? Or are they saying that they're going to change the antitrust laws to go after companies like this? Because I think it's also important to point out that when it comes to companies like this, generally the way that you break up companies is that you say there's a harm to consumers.
Yes.
But with companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google and Apple and really almost every tech company, their services are free to use, or they're not imposing any externalities on consumers.
Yeah, if you watch ads, I'll be fair, you have to watch ads and share your data, but that's the deal.
But you're not paying money, which is not how the consumer welfare standard works. So are they proposing like an overhaul of the antitrust laws to go after these companies?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's important to distinguish between what was true under the current laws, like what would happen if a court case were brought today, because I think it's pretty clear, my analysis, the experts that I read in the market, and we'll hear from our guests shortly here soon, is that the cases are pretty weak and they probably would lose in court. The executives, Mark Zuckerberg, in moments of honesty, has said that he thinks they'd win in court even if the government does bring a case against them. But that's not to say that you couldn't change the antitrust laws, and I don't necessarily advocate for that. But Congress, certain members of Congress are advocating for that to bring in other things beyond consumers. Let's talk about level of employment, inequality. How do businesses affect the environment? If you started bringing those kind of questions into the debate, that might change the analysis in terms of how we think about is big is bad. And other Congress people are talking about having clear cutoffs for size. So at a certain size, you just can't buy any more companies. And that would be a significant change to merger laws. And so Congress is in that process. I don't predict that they'll be successful just because I don't see bipartisan support for that. I don't see enough members that will be able to do that. But some of them want to, and the context for our listeners in this hearing is that this is the 6th hearing in a series, and the majority Democrats on the subcommittee will be releasing a report shortly, summarizing their findings, making recommendations. Maybe there'll be a bill following that, and so they might be advocating for changing the U.S. antitrust laws, because I would say most observers say that under current laws, the tech companies would likely win.
Which is, I mean, unsurprising to see what happened with Microsoft, which was a notable absence today.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Microsoft. So, Microsoft, the last big monopolization case, the last big tech company to face antitrust scrutiny in the late 90s. I don't know if everyone, or for our younger people who don't study this for their job like I do, it's important to note that Microsoft ended up settling that case. So they lost in the circuit court, but then on appeal, the government dropped the case before going to the Supreme Court and said, we're gonna settle with this company. And so Microsoft was not broken up. There was a consent decree to kind of limit certain behaviors that Microsoft was doing, but it didn't fundamentally change its company. It didn't change that Microsoft ended up beating Netscape in the browser wars, right? Mm-hmm. Internet Explorer reached virtual monopoly status for a while before Google came along and made a better browser. And innovation ended up unseating them, but it wasn't an antitrust regulator that unseated Microsoft in that market. It was Facebook and Google creating better products and using the open web to do that, to where that they could reach consumers.
So would you say today, though, overall, this was an improvement on past antitrust conversations that Congress has had, or was this a decline? Because my impression is that this is better than what we saw the first time Zuckerberg came to the Hill and other times that they had these antitrust hearings, but it wasn't a vast improvement.
That's a fair point. I would say it's better on the tech side. So this is the first time we've had all 4 tech CEOs testifying in front of Congress. So it's a better tech conversation. I was disappointed by the level of antitrust knowledge that was on display from Congress people during this hearing. But I would say that because it's the 6th hearing in a series, the same members have been prepped by their staffs, have been asking similar questions of other companies in these markets, and so they definitely had more sophistication than they've been dropped into this.
Let's play quickly the clip of Jim Jordan and his
please
unmasking moment, because there was a lot of funny moments during this hearing, but I think this one just like captured the absurdity of it all. Let's listen.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to redirect your attention to antitrust law rather than fringe conspiracy theories. Mr. Bezos, our investigation...
Mr. Chairman, we have the email. There is no fringe...
Excuse me. It's not your time.
Mr. Jordan, you do not have the time. Please be respectful of your colleague. She controls the time.
Put your mask on. Put your mask on.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Raskin,
Mr. Jordan.
You want to talk about masks.
Mr. Jordan, Ms. Scanlon.
Why would the Deputy Secretary of Treasury unmask
Mr.
Michael Flynn's name, Mr. Raskin? And what I want to know is, when someone comes after my motives for asking questions, I get a chance to respond.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But overall, I mean, I'm going to be very curious to see what report comes out after this is all said and done, and what the bill will most likely be. I mean, I'd expect that to probably come out after January of this year. Probably if Joe Biden wins, we'll see that bill hit the floor, and Joe Biden will have to come out and make a stance.
Yeah, so the report will come out very shortly, but in terms of what legislation comes after that, yeah, we'll see how long that delay is on the legislation front.
Because nothing's going to get taken up during a Republican presidency.
During the height of a presidential campaign in a divided Congress, I don't think you'll see any movement on legislation this cycle.
So what are your predictions on what changes Congress is going to propose? I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but if you were someone who was really concerned with antitrust as an issue, and I think both of us have concerns about antitrust that apply to other industries that aren't tech, but it is shaping up for this antitrust bill to be a tech antitrust bill. What do you think they're going to propose? And then alternatively, I will pose the question, what antitrust changes do you think should be made? Because there are definitely markets that are concentrated that there currently isn't being enough action taken against.
Yeah. So I think to your first point, I think I mentioned a little bit the changes they're looking to do, but people who are critics of tech often want to see a broader standards. They want to see considerations that aren't just about consumers. They want to see workers brought more into the fold. I would argue that on a consumer welfare standard, you can consider, if employers collude with each other to hold down wages, there have been cases brought against them. That is still a cartel. So it's not like you can't prosecute those cases, but critics, especially progressives, neo-Brandeisians as they're called in this debate, want to see a much broader standard that brings in all sorts of progressive goals and achieve them through antitrust. So to do that, you need to broaden the standard. And so I don't think that'll be successful in terms of actually changing the law, but that is the goal. And in terms of other sectors, so PPI, I'm just going to plug this real quick. We're currently releasing what's called the Resilient Recovery Report. It's coming out shortly. And I have one section where I talk about a couple sectors that actually need more antitrust intervention and more attention from competition officials. So the first thing would be food processing. So we've actually seen food shortages. We haven't seen any downtime on the internet. So the telecom companies have done a good job keeping service up as we move from businesses to homes. Tech platforms have had all uptime. So Zoom went from 10 million daily meeting participants to 300 million daily meeting participants. So huge surge in growth, but no downtime. You never saw it logged into Zoom and it just crashed, right? So they've been very flexible and resilient. But our food industry, which is extremely concentrated and susceptible to viruses like COVID, had huge problems. And if it were more decentralized, more competitive, I think you wouldn't see problems like that. And the hospital sector is another one that people talk about. There have been tons of consolidation, mergers in hospital sectors, actual price increases, quality reductions that are measurable, that are actionable under consumer welfare standard that regulators could go at today without changing the law. And so I think, and again, hospitals, they've done their best, but they've been really strained by this crisis. And so if every big city, instead of having just one major hospital, had multiple, if they didn't have vetoes on who can enter their markets, those are the sort of questions that I'd be asking about the hospital industry as well.
Well, on that note, I will like to welcome our first guest, Sam Bowman. Sam Bowman is the... Sam, I'm just going to bring you on. I'm going to let you say your title, because I know what organization you work for, but I forget your new title.
I lose track of them as well, to be honest. At the moment, I think I'm Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics. But we'll see how the broadcast goes tonight, and I can check in with you in the morning.
Well, Sam, did you watch the hearings all the way in Britain? Which, by the way, it is currently midnight where you are right now?
It's midnight. So this is really the equivalent of the Champions League final, in European terms, and obviously very exciting. And I know you guys were just as thrilled as me that it was running up to the 6-hour mark. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that bed isn't looking attractive right now, but it was sometimes enjoyable. No, it's a real pleasure. Sometimes enjoyable, and I think you picked a great clip to put on just before that little frisson of tension between the two representatives was fun. But I mean, it was a little bit depressing. And I have to say, as somebody in the UK, seldom have I ever seen something that has made me think that parliamentary selectivity look impressive. But I have to admit that this was one of those occasions.
Yeah, Sam, what would you say about the quality? So Colin just asked me this, but I'm curious, you have the UK perspective as well, and you're obviously an expert in competition policy. What would you say about the quality of questions that were asked and the type of questions that were asked? Did any of them impress you? What would you say the average level of knowledge about U.S. Antitrust law was displayed? Were these on point ever?
No, to be honest, I think the quality of the questioning was pretty terrible. In terms of just the logic, a lot of the questions assume their conclusion. It's a kind of slightly odd phrasing, but this expression, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" type question, where you assume your conclusion. The question is worded in such a way that there's no way of answering it that doesn't accept wrongdoing on your part. And I was kind of taken aback by the way that at least as much or more time was taken asking questions as was given to the CEOs answering the questions. I lost track of the number of times CEOs were cut off in the middle of questions to move on to another one. And, some of the questions were completely insane. One of them was asked by the chairman, I believe, of the House Judiciary Committee, the more senior level committee. Do you use data to improve your products and services? Now, I'm sure there's a germ of an interesting point there, and I'm sure somewhere at some point that sounded like a good idea to ask. But if you think about it, to ask if you use data to improve your products and services, you kind of wonder if they even understand the basic words they're using there. It was a little bit disappointing. I think in a more substantive way, the thing that's kind of maybe obvious to people, but I think is really worth pointing out, is that loads of the questions and loads of the problems that people had were not antitrust problems. And I think that that's kind of the ultimate, the root here. A lot of the issues people were bringing up, things like political bias, things like content moderation more generally. There were lots of questions about, for example, COVID and basically effectively kind of lies about, quack treatments for COVID and so on. And things like, capricious treatment of business and things like that. These are really important questions. And I think it's right for Congress to ask these questions. And I think in a functioning democracy, you need oversight of powerful businesses. And these are powerful businesses with respect to things like this. The question is whether antitrust is the way to solve these problems, or if there are indeed problems here, whether antitrust is the right tool to address them. And probably won't surprise you to hear that I don't think it is in most cases. But I think what's interesting is to ask, why are we here? Why are we focusing on antitrust? And I think the reason is that there probably isn't a congressional majority for an actual remedy or for an actual solution to a lot of these problems individually. The only thing they can do is coalesce around antitrust as a kind of cover-all, catch-all solution to a bunch of different problems that kind of collectively they can add together and say, here's a problem with Google or here's a problem with Facebook. And I think that ultimately that's kind of why I think this is quite unstable, because the more scrutiny you put these proposals under and the more you try to say, well, look, we're going to solve this problem of political bias using antitrust, then other people realize, well, my problem isn't political bias. My problem is capricious treatment of small business. And I'm not sure that the way you're doing this actually works for that. So this is why I'm kind of vaguely optimistic, despite a very, very dispiriting hearing.
Right. I don't think they're going to get very far with this kind of framework or approach to these questions. But Sam, you had a great op-ed in The Hill, I believe it was published this morning, talking about sectors that might actually need antitrust intervention. I did a poor job answering a similar question from Colin earlier. But you just talk about the ideas in that op-ed and where you see a potential, actually where antitrust would be helpful and any potential changes to the antitrust law that you'd like to see, or are you satisfied with all the current antitrust law?
Sure. Thanks for reading and for your kind words. The point of the piece is to kind of point out that antitrust is about the whole economy. It's not just about tech. And if you come to the conclusion, as I think we should, that antitrust probably isn't the way we should be solving problems that exist in tech, then you have to accept that there are probably other areas in the economy that we should be looking at. I think it's really interesting and noteworthy that Joe Biden hasn't really been making a big issue of big tech. He has been talking about, for example, non-compete agreements, non-compete clauses in the contracts for fast food workers and other low-paid workers. And that's I mean, I was really struck by that. I think it was last week, maybe the week before. He gave an interview where he kind of kept coming back to that. The interview was trying to ask him about cancel culture, and he was basically saying, I don't care about cancel culture. I don't care about what's woke.
Right.
I am interested in non-compete agreements for fast food workers. And to me, that was really interesting. But it might give you what the Biden administration would look like, and because I think it probably is an issue that a committee like the House Antitrust Subcommittee should be looking at. Non-compete agreements are, I think, pretty justifiable when it comes to highly skilled workers, especially ones that are dealing with trade secrets or ones you might want to invest a lot of time and capital into to kind of really train them up. But it's much less justifiable. I think it's still justifiable in some respects, but there's a debate to be had about whether the kind of costs outweigh the benefits for low-skilled workers. And then I also looked at a letter that was sent by some very eminent antitrust scholars who are more on the favor of intervention to the House subcommittee through the Center for Equitable Growth. And they, interestingly, identified a couple of sectors that they thought were particularly in need of kind of antitrust intervention. And they weren't tech sectors. They were airlines, hospitals, as Alec was talking about before I came on, and brewing. And at least for airlines and hospitals, what's really striking is how heavily regulated they are in a kind of quite clearly protectionist way. In airlines, you have what are called cabotage laws, which effectively prevent foreign airlines from competing on domestic routes. And of course, in Europe, where airline fares are extremely cheap, that has been driven by competition by foreign airlines like Ryanair from Ireland, EasyJet from the UK, and so on, in domestic routes internationally. So the piece tries to look at a few other things. I mean, there are some perennial issues like Luxottica, which is the company that makes basically every designer sunglasses pair on the planet. Armani, Ray-Ban, Persol, they're all made by the same company that licenses these brands. And it's certainly worth investigating whether there's a deeper problem there. And I think kind of issues like the NCAA. And then the final point I made, and I think is really, really important, whoever wins the presidential election later this year, is what's happened to the antitrust agencies under the Trump administration. We've now had a few stories, for example, in the cannabis industry, in the automobile industry in California, where the Department of Justice seems to have been using its powers to extract basically political ends, and I mean, really clearly out of order, completely out of keeping and out of tradition, and potentially a threat to the rule of law. And the fact that antitrust powers that we currently have are being used in that way, I think is bears looking at. Also, I think bears us kind of considering whether we want to invest further powers and further discretionary abilities into agencies like that, given that we know what can happen when quite a bad actor comes into control of them.
Than the U.S. does, and so they're using that to kind of roadmap or talk about what a potential U.S. case would look like against these same tech companies for similar violations. So I think you could just give us a quick summary of like what you've learned from those reports, what you think of them, and how the relationship between the U.K. and the U.S. on competition law works.
Sure. Well, the Competition and Markets Authority, which is our competition regulator, recently concluded its investigation into the digital advertising market, which really focused heavily on Facebook and Google for obvious reasons. It's worth pointing out that a lot of its conclusions were actually quite a lot more benign than some of the earlier possibilities it had raised in its interim report. And that was that interim report that Fiona Scott-Morton used as the kind of basis for her roadmaps for antitrust cases against Google. So, for example, in the interim report, where the CMA basically raises issues that have been given to it and says, these are things we're interested in. We're not certain if this is going to happen or not. We're not certain if this is an issue, but we're going to investigate it. It raises a few possibilities about pricing and so on. Fiona Scott-Morton in her roadmaps take those kind of possibilities as kind of a given. Later on, subsequently in the final report, the CMA has come to much, much more benign conclusions about, for example, how much Google charges for display advertising compared to competitors. Basically, it says that Google's charges are pretty much in line with the rest of the market. Now, from the point of view of the US, and I think from the point of view of the world, what's interesting is, I could talk to you for an hour about my quibbles with the CMA's approach. I think the important takeaways are CMA didn't find any actual, tangible, real-world examples of consumer harm. It can hypothesize about examples of this, but after a year, it's not able to find any direct examples of consumer harm. And what that implies is that this might be a debate about rents within the advertising chain. Basically, publishers, newspapers, websites, advertisers, and intermediaries arguing about who gets what size share of the pie, rather than a more fundamental argument about the overall cost of advertising or the overall effect on consumers of advertising. The CMA, having said all that, is recommending a code of conduct, which is effectively regulation for Google and Facebook. We're now in the process of considering in the UK what that would look like if that would actually come into effect. I have to say that I think that it's somewhat early days. The CMA has somewhat overstepped its mark. Some of the powers it's called for have been kind of astonishing, and kind of, in one case, for example, it's called for itself to have extra legal powers to break up companies without going through the kind of due process that it currently has to go through. Everybody I've spoken to who's sort of formerly of the CMA, and including a few people who are currently at the CMA, think is pretty outrageous. And I think people in government in the UK who have to ultimately approve this think that's pretty crazy. Right now, the question is, what will this code of conduct regulation look like in practice, and what are the costs and trade-offs and risks? And it's that final point, the costs and the trade-offs and the risks to things like innovation and investment and the formation of new companies. That's the thing that nobody really has taken the time to consider yet. And I think that's the next step in the UK. I know that the CMA's report is going to be very influential in the US. I know the DOJ, as it's considering a case against Google, is going to be heavily influenced by this. It's really important to understand those points, and it's really important to understand the CMA hasn't looked at things like trade-offs. It's not really its job, but it is going to have to be somebody's job.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us. And when the bill finally hits Congress, maybe in January, I don't know, I'm not going to make any predictions when that's going to come out. We'll have to have you back on to dissect it. But I hope you have a good night and get some well-deserved rest.
Thanks very much, guys. Have a good evening.
So while we get ready for our next guest to come on, Alec, can you just talk to me a little bit about European competition law? Because that is a whole other monster that's been going on. And I think one fun thing maybe to talk about would be the Irish case that happened really recently with, or did it happen recently? Yeah, the final ruling came out recently about the Ireland Apple tax haven case.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Sam was just giving us a great summary of UK competition policy. Obviously, the UK has left the EU with Brexit, and so most of the news stories you hear about Europeans going after US tech companies, that's related to the European Commission, part of the EU. And they had done a case against Ireland about, called a state aid case, saying that Ireland's tax breaks that they were giving to companies unfairly favored Apple. That Apple actually owed, I believe, something like $15 billion more to the Irish government. So the EU was intervening to force Apple to pay the Irish government more. Ireland was saying, we don't want to do this. We like our current tax policies. We think it incentivizes the right kind of behaviors in terms of investment and companies wanting to locate here. And in the end, the European Commission lost that case on appeal. And so Apple will not be forced to pay that money, and Ireland will not be forced to change its tax laws. And that's under the state aid classification of a country can't give state aid to companies. So there's like a race to the bottom effect where European countries are competing against each other. That was the basis of the case, but they ended up losing because I think the main reason being that Ireland applies its laws consistently, and so they couldn't argue that it was a specific carve-out for Apple.
So now our next guest is the president of the International Center for Law and Economics, Jeff Mann.
Jeff Manny.
Jeff Manny. You would know it better than me. You used to work there.
I used to work at my last job, yeah.
Who will now be able to come and talk to us from a more American perspective what's going on. Jeff, you're now live, and welcome.
Great. Thanks, guys. Nice to be here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly.
Great. You should know that I'm doing this from a strip mall parking lot somewhere near Salem, Oregon. So, as American as it gets. Well, I don't know. Oregon's not really American.
Using broadband networks and tech platforms for video streaming. We got it all covered.
Exactly.
Coming in loud and clear. So,
Good.
Jeff, first, just overall thoughts on the hearing, your opinion on what went down, favorite moment, least favorite moment, and then we'll get into more specifics after that.
Okay. Let's see. My big takeaway was probably that there was not, I thought, to the extent that this was actually about antitrust and about the majority report that Cicilline mentioned and that will be coming out, and then ultimately potentially legislation. One important takeaway I think was there was not a lot for what I think will be the majority report and subsequently for any kind of legislation that might come out of that. I think that's the most relevant thing to the actual content or the supposed content of the hearing. Now, the vast majority of the content of the hearing was completely antitrust irrelevant. The Republicans just wanted to air grievances about the tech platforms, and not only did they not try, but nor do I think they could have tied those things to the antitrust laws or to competition or anything relevant to the ostensible topic. In a weird way, I would say that was true of the Democrats as well. Their list of grievances, which they typically aired and then didn't allow the CEOs to respond to, were antitrust relevant. I actually think that they were talking at some length about a number of issues that we can talk about that are properly within the scope of an antitrust investigation. But they also, so for them, those were their grievances. For the most part, it seemed to me those were grievances about harms that they saw, whether they're actually harms or not, we can discuss, but harms that they saw to particular competitors. I don't think there was a whole lot of discussion about harms to actual consumers, which is, of course, what the antitrust laws require. I think in that sense, it was notable that that again, both sides seemed to mostly be interested in, as I said, sort of airing their grievances. Whether any of this will really likely be helpful for or lead to any kind of reform of the antitrust laws is I guess a purely political question, because there was really almost nothing at the hearing that would actually be relevant to that. You asked high and low points. I'll really quickly. High point for me was actually Mark Zuckerberg's opening statement had this one section in it that I thought was really, really good, where he talked about, and Alec, you'll especially appreciate this, where he mentioned that competition is so much broader than the very narrow conception that seemed to be kind of animating a lot of what was going on there. So Google buying YouTube allowed it to compete with cable companies, and Facebook buying WhatsApp and operating messaging system wasn't about competing with WhatsApp or not competing with WhatsApp. It's about competing with SMS and telcos. Amazon buying Whole Foods, he points out, is about competition with Walmart and Kroger. I think, I thought that was very insightful, and I don't know if he actually wrote it. He probably didn't, so I don't want to make he was insightful, but those words were actually very
he let them keep it in there, at least,
Yeah, exactly. He said them. So it's got to mean something, right?
Yeah.
Low
point.
God, there were so many. Low point. I guess everything that Representative Gratz, I don't know how you pronounce his name. Matt Gates said. I mean, pretty much everything that he said was a low point. It was really an appalling display, I thought, and you know, I don't know. Here's the positive spin on that. So maybe it's not a low point. The positive spin is he and as I said, most of the Republicans spent so much time talking about things that were so irrelevant to antitrust, and for which I think they got in some really, you know, politically meaningful shots. Maybe they'll feel satisfied, and you know, having said what they wanted to say at this hearing in front of however many thousands of people were tuned in, maybe they'll feel like, okay, we've gotten that out of our system, and we don't need to rewrite the freaking, can I swear on this? The antitrust law, you know, laws of general.
I think you're last
address things. What's that? Yeah, I know. I meant, is it your rules?
Yeah, you're good. You're good. Yeah.
So
Jeff, one of my favorite tweets throughout this that anyone sent, that I love when you cited your previous paper on hot docs, because I think one of the most powerful parts of the hearing, and this is true for any congressional hearing, is when they produce some document, an internal document from the companies that they have received at some previous point in time, and they're quoting the executive back to themselves or something another executive had said to them in emails, and it sounds very damning to anyone listening. It sounds like, oh, they're talking about how badly they're going to crush their competitor. This happened a lot with Facebook in the hearing in terms of members of Congress bringing up documents, internal documents, to Zuckerberg and asking about them, trying to defend them. But you tweeted out a previous paper talking about how antitrust experts should think about hot docs, as they're known, hot docs, in an antitrust case. So can you just talk about your philosophy and opinion on that?
Sure. Yeah, so there are a couple of things. Thanks for saying that. The first thing is that I didn't really write about this exactly in the paper, but it's sort of evident from the way they were brought up in this hearing. You know, these things are often taken out of context, and even if they could have the kind of meaning that's being imparted to them, you know, I think often it's just not the case that they mean what it sounds like they mean. Some of the responses from some of the CEOs sort of made that clear, like the one where was it Bezos or Zuckerberg, I can't remember, said, that sounds to me like that was a joke.
This is Zuckerberg, I think.
But, you know, indeed, that's the case in some of these cases. So, okay, but that's less interesting. More interestingly is the reality that antitrust law deals with effects. It deals with the ability to identify anti-competitive consequences, and intent, motivation have nothing to do with antitrust. One tiny slice of antitrust that's irrelevant to all of this, but for the most part, intent is irrelevant. So what most of those docs might show you, in the worst case scenario, is you know, you could see a document from one of those CEOs or someone else at the company saying, you know, let's do X because that will give us market power and we'll be able to crush our competitors. The kind of implicit assumption is that if they do X, they will get the result they want, is just untenable. I mean, it could happen, but I don't think, there are lots of reasons that business people who are sort of steeped in this exercise are kind of ironically not very well positioned to know you know, what kinds of activities are going to actually help them crush their competitors. Most business, maybe most, yeah, I think I'll say most business is kind of rooted in a sort of trial and error. You watch what others do. You sometimes try it. That, by the way, another thing we should talk about. Big theme of this hearing was watching what other people do and doing the same thing with the imputed notion that somehow that was anti-competitive. That's how competition works. You watch what others do and you say, well, you know, consumers seem to like that, I'm going to do it. Whether you're actually going to be successful at that, even just because someone else did it. So this goes, in other words, for competitive intent as well as anti-competitive intent. That's another matter completely. And one of the things that antitrust does in particular is it really abstracts away from humans who are involved in this, from human capital, from organizational capital, from organizational culture, goodwill, all these intangible assets that go into what makes a company successful are kind of just, they're just abstracted away. They're hard to quantify, they're hard to measure, they're hard to see. So we look at product markets and we look at these indicia of competition, and the reality is that that's not really what competition is about. And most of these executives often don't know either. So, you know, they may think, like antitrust enforcers do, that, hey, if we buy company X, we'll crush the competition and we'll be dominant. Well, it turns out that there's about 9,000 variables that they didn't consider, and that make that something they wish, but not something that we should assume happened just because they wanted it to happen.
Gotcha. Well, Jeff,
that was a long answer.
No, as a great summary of the paper. I liked it. And for my final question, I know that this hearing, like most hearings, is an open process. So the committee, and I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was this hearing was the one that you and your organization were a leading drafter and signer of a letter making your own recommendations. I believe you had dozens of names on that letter, academics, Nobel laureates, etc. I'm just curious if you share with our audience what you recommended to the committee on how we should approach our antitrust laws.
Sure, I'll give a couple of examples. I think we had 9 possible reforms to antitrust laws. The letter was signed by 23 people, I think, so not quite dozens, but almost dozens.
So close.
Somebody pulled out at the last minute. We just wanted 24. The point of that was not that all 23 agree with all of these recommendations. It was really, though, to point out that people have been talking about reforming antitrust law for a long time. Like with any legislative or regulatory scheme, of course, it can always be improved. And it would be ridiculous to think that critics like me of the kind of the process that seems to be underway in the congressional investigation, critics of that process aren't saying there's nothing wrong here and somehow we got it perfect the first time out and everything since then has been perfect and there's nothing.
Jeff, we're kind of losing you there. Can you repeat what you said for the past 10 seconds?
So, okay?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah,
now.
You sound much better now.
No?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Those cursed broadband networks. Tom, you still good?
Yep. You're good.
Okay. So in the last 10 seconds, I said I think there's been efforts or discussions around ways we could reform or improve antitrust law and enforcement for a long time, and we collected 9 of the most prominent of those that not everyone agreed with, but ranging from things like putting more effort into cartel enforcement. I actually don't happen to agree with this one, but there are a lot of people who think that we're barking up the wrong tree. That we do actually have a pretty good reason to think that certain cartel activity is anti-competitive in a way that with a lot of the stuff we're talking about with tech companies, we don't actually know for sure. So why aren't we devoting resources to those things? Ostensive. I mean, in some cases, the measurable benefit would be huge, that, for example, would be something. Occupational licensing, been much discussed. Occupational licensing and other government suborned or government organized impediments to competition, and often, like with occupational licensing, barriers to entry, are a much bigger and more persistent problem than problems that might emerge in markets. People have been asking for a long time for the agencies to spend more time doing that. The FTC has taken an interest in some of those, and there's an important Supreme Court case recently where the FTC won, challenging some occupational licensing. But there's something that could be done more consistently. And then I'll raise just one more. As I said, there were 9. So one more that I thought that I think is potentially very useful is, instead of looking at the FTC in particular as an enforcer, I'm not saying they shouldn't be an enforcer and a regulator, but they also have a unique ability to collect information, potentially make information available to others, and act as a bit of a convener around understanding these markets better. I mean, I started out, or at one point in this discussion, I pointed out that the big problem in antitrust is identifying which things are actually anti-competitive, and that's especially true in relatively new markets that are operating in ways that we've never really experienced before. So, I couldn't fault anyone for trying to collect more information. You can't even fault the congressional investigation that we're talking about here. Of course, they should be doing that. They should be collecting information, but The agencies do not, as far as I know, the FTC in particular, does not do a very good job of sort of inviting in economists and other relevant thinkers, giving them access to information, obviously anonymized or with confidentiality agreements, whatever, and coordinating them, trying to understand something that we don't understand. My biggest problem with most of the antitrust over exuberance that I see is that we just don't know enough to be confident about the kinds of things that many folks want to do. But an important corollary to that is, if we were confident, if we did actually know more, I would have to be supportive. So why don't we spend our time jumping to the idea that we see problems, we know enough, we know what to do about it, let's just go ahead and do it.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. This is definitely a very enlightening discussion. And the next time there's an antitrust debate going on, we'll have to have you back.
I'd be happy to come anytime. Always a pleasure with my former colleague, Alec. Thanks for having me.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.
So, now we're going to bring on our next guest, Ramsey Woodcock, who I think will be our... Do you think he's going to advocate on behalf of further antitrust action?
Well,
on the tech companies?
I'm a big fan of Ramsey's work, so I have a good hint of what he's going to suggest, and I'm going to ask him for more specifics. But in terms of his general philosophy, we're excited to have him on because we just heard from Jeff Manny and Sam Bowman, who both are at ICLE, which is a libertarian-ish organization. And I'm really excited to talk to Ramsey Woodcock because he's a professor of law at the University of Kentucky. He shares kind of the progressive center-left, however you want to frame PPI's goal and mission in terms of what kind of social outcomes he wants to see. But he is a rigorous antitrust thinker. And so my guess is Ramsey's going to say that he's not in favor of breaking up the big tech companies, but he does want to see more regulation that he thinks would be a better way of achieving that goal. But I'm excited to hear more details from him.
Well, let's see if we can get... Ramsey, are you there? I think Ramsey's there, but I think he's on a little bit of a lag.
A little bit of a delay.
Can you hear me? Yes, I think I'm here.
Should we have him rejoin?
No, I think... Ramsey, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear us? Seems like we're a bit on a lag with Ramsey. I'm going to give him a call back and see if we can get him on the line better. Because also his video is not coming in. He should be on video. Let's go back. I'm going to give him another call and let's see if this works.
Fingers crossed.
Currently waiting for him to answer.
I can also give you a phone number if you want to just call him in.
I could try that. I don't think I can call him necessarily. Unless let's see. Yeah, they add a Skype credit to call this number. We're not going to do that. All right, let's try.
So much for free services, am I right?
Let's see. Ramsey, can you hear us now?
How about now?
Oh, I think we've got you. 1 second. Oh, there you are. All right, give us 1 second and we'll load you up.
I can hear you.
Oh no, we're still on the lag.
Ramsey, how you doing?
I can hear you, yeah.
Great. So, I think we're having a bit of an echo issue, but we'll try to ignore that. I'll mute microphones selectively as we go. But can you tell me what were your top takeaways from today's hearing?
I'm doing well. It might be best to call into me, with the.
Oh yeah, we're completely out of sync. All right, Ramsey, we're gonna have to let you go. We'll try giving you a call back. We actually can't do phone calls on our platform, but we'll see if we can get it in sync in a little bit. I'm sorry. All right, so we are going to switch to our next guest, which is former FTC Commissioner Joshua Wright.
Yes.
Let's hope that we can get Ramsey on the phone because I think that'll be a very interesting conversation. But I currently cannot call people.
While I'm talking to Josh, can we add credit?
What?
While we're talking to Josh, can we add credit?
Yeah.
I can give you my card if you need my card.
Hello, Josh. How are you? Doing well. All right, give us one moment to load you up, and then we'll be ready to go.
And while we're loading him up, I'll give an quick introduction. So, Professor Joshua Wright, he's a professor of law at George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia. Professor Wright is also a former commissioner of the FTC, so we're excited to hear his perspective for someone who's been an antitrust regulator, has had to actually fight these cases, bring cases successfully, decide when to bring a case or not to bring a case. So we're really excited for his expertise. He also has a PhD in economics, so he has both the economics perspective as well as a legal perspective on these questions. I'm really excited to have him on here. So are we loaded?
We are loaded. Josh is ready to go.
All right. So I'll get us started off here. So during the hearing, Professor Wright, you tweeted about a lot of questions about copying. So the idea that Facebook in particular, but all these companies have copied their competitors. So Facebook copying Snapchat stories at Instagram and on other Facebook platforms. And you had a tweet talking about how antitrust regulators, and we should think about this in terms of competition law. So you should explain for our audience, like, how does an antitrust regulator think about when it's legal to copy and when it's not legal to copy?
Sure, and thanks for having me on. Antitrust grapples with this question about copying in a number of different contexts. So let me sort of give a tiny bit of background here, which starts from the sort of beginning, right? Antitrust is about competition, and from the antitrust perspective, competition is a virtue. Competition is good. Imitation is a form of competition, right? If I can copy your product and sell it for cheaper, you might lose, you being my competitor, but consumers win. And what antitrust is about at the end of the day is not the well-being of the individual competitors, but about the competitive process generating benefits for consumers. So if I can increase competition and generate benefits for consumers, that is not only sort of a thing that antitrust is neutral about, but we sort of cheer it, right? In other parts of the law, copying ain't so good, right? So we have patent law and copyright law and trade secret law, and we sort of establish the property rights for what's mine and what's not mine, right? What you can copy and compete with against me and not. And what antitrust law says is sort of within the bound of legal copying, that is good stuff, right? There aren't antitrust violations that say more competition via copying is bad. The example I used in the tweet, Alec, that you were referencing is in the pharmaceutical space, right? So in the pharma space, the FTC, including when I was there as commissioner for a couple of years, was on a mission about a particular type of copying, right? So we get generic drugs go and they make a generic form of some molecule and they want to compete and drug prices fall dramatically, right? And so there's a lot of games that brand name patented drugs play to sort of keep generic entry away because they want to make money while they can on the drug, that the brand name drug that they are selling. And so one of the things that they do is they enter into settlements, patent settlements, right? So generic wants to enter, branded sues the generic guy and says, hey, you're infringing my patent. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but they get together and they have a settlement in which the branded guy, Merck or whoever, gives a bag of a lot of money to the generic and says, stay out of the market for a while. FTC sues them. Used to sue them and win because it was per se illegal. Now they sue and they win under the rule of reason. It was a Supreme Court case in Activist a couple years ago. But that's sort of the basic idea, right? Is copying, to the extent it is a form of competitive rivalry, is a good thing. It is a great thing because consumers benefit a great deal from it. So sort of go outside of the pharmaceutical context to the context raised in the hearings. It is Google scrapes stuff off the internet and provides snippets and includes them in search results. Or, that was one of the examples offered, and you can sort of name some of the other ones. Amazon looks at its data and decides consumers are really liking batteries or whatever, and we can make them cheaper and get them to people faster. And so we're going to copy a handful of successful products and sort of do a private label, which they do sparingly but successfully when they do it. That sort of copying in the antitrust context is a feature, not a bug, right? We have other bodies of law that sort of draw the boundaries of where, copyright or trade secret or patent should kind of draw the line between legal and illegal. But lawful copying that results in lower prices is not just something antitrust tolerates. That is something that antitrust celebrates, and sort of rightly so, because it is consumers, because of enhanced competition, getting cheaper batteries and better search results and so forth and so on.
So you mentioned rule of reason. Could you just explain to our audience who maybe aren't well versed in antitrust terminology what rule of reason is?
Yeah, sure. So antitrust has think two modes of analysis, and per se rules and rule of reason. And it used to be the case in antitrust, if we sort of went back 50 years and read antitrust cases, they were sort of two completely different boxes. And you would look at the agreement in front of you and you'd say, okay, this is a tying arrangement or resale price maintenance, where, Coca-Cola tells the supermarket at what price to sell its product, right? Sort of a vertical within the supply chain agreement. But antitrust used to say, classify the type of agreement, and then it would choose per se for the stuff that we thought was bad, and rule of reason for stuff we thought, we don't know. Sometimes this is bad, sometimes it's good. The kind of short punchline history of antitrust is, since its inception in 1890, sort of went through a time period where basically everything was per se unlawful, and that starts unwinding in the 70s, right? To where now we have a couple of things, naked price fixing, always bad. We send people to jail, always bad for consumers. That's per se. A couple of other things, but most of what we do now is sort of a case-by-case approach. And so the exact nuances of the case-by-case approach and what evidence is needed kind of differs across horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, whatever. It's context specific. But when you hear rule of reason, for your listeners less familiar with antitrust, you should substitute in your head case-by-case analysis where we try to figure out whether the conduct helped or harmed competition and consumers.
Gotcha. So I also saw, thank you for that great explanation. I also saw you tweet during the hearings that you thought Nagus and Jayapal, so two members of Congress, have been the most impressive questioners, though the record would have been improved with answers. So I'd like to just hear why you thought they had impressive questions, and what makes them impressive, and what would you have liked to see more of, and what would you like to see less of in these kind of hearings?
Yeah, well, I'm glad somebody reads my Twitter, Alex. So thank you. You and my mom.
Yeah, exactly.
So my mom thinks I should be nicer, but so everyone's got a view. So here's what I thought about the hearing in particular, and then the hearing in general, and then those questions. So my sort of takeaway from the hearing was not a lot of information sort of gathered, right? Lots of talking about, not a lot of information produced in the hearing, right? So lots of discussion about how much evidence they have, dramatic readings of emails which are largely public or have been disclosed in some other way, shape, or form, and lots of cutting off folks who are there to answer questions, right? So dramatic question reading, cut people off, shout out, I reclaim my time, and then sort of move to the next question, right? And I have students, and Alec, you've been in my classroom at some point. I have students who would love if I did the Socratic method this way, right? And never actually had them answer questions. But it is not a great mechanism for producing information. And I thought both sides, right? So on the Republican side of the aisle, it is, shout things about conservative bias, sort of vent feelings about conservative bias by tech companies, but not really extract much in the way of information. And sometimes, and maybe a lot of the time, that's what these hearings are, and fine, right? So my general takeaway was not very useful as an exercise of investigation, but hearings do multiple things, and actually producing information is only sometimes what they do, and sometimes it's a marketing or sort of theatric tool. And so, to the extent whether it was a good thing as a theater kind of political tool, I don't really know. But I do think, and what stood out to me in the questions of the two the congressman and woman that you mentioned, was they were well versed in the facts. They asked real questions, right? So the questions that I had in mind, I mean, some of those questions were directed at Amazon in particular, but the questions were about the use of third-party data of merchants on the platform and the effect it has on Amazon's products, right? Do they use that information to make better products? What happens to the merchants? What's the effect on consumers? I thought those questions were well-formed. They were questions that, if they allowed answers, would have been a nice addition to the record. Most of what I've heard in the record is complaints about individual competitors or firms, right? So tell a story about diapers.com, tell a story about Yelp, tell a story about a rival. Antitrust isn't about that. If I outcompete the rival and enhance competition, right? If I outcompete the lemonade stand across the street, consumers benefit, it's fine. If I do something that suppresses competition and also hurts the rival, it's not. It is not, pro-competitive things I do hurt the rival. Anti-competitive things I do hurt the rival. What I need in antitrust is something that distinguishes pro-competitive from anti-competitive. So we sort of look at overall impact on consumers. That piece was missing, right? So it was, you sell batteries for cheap after you allow merchants on the platform. Fine, but not an antitrust question. What happens to consumers and sort of the long-run dynamic of merchants coming on the platform? Or the same for Google and the Yelp complaints. Are consumers made better off or worse off? Barely touched upon in the hearing. I thought some of those questions targeted the interesting stuff. Nobody was interested in the answers, and I think that sort of, I don't know, it sort of told me what I needed to know about the hearing. My other kind of big picture general impression, which you didn't ask me, but I'm gonna throw at you anyway, is I sort of, and this is maybe the one piece that surprised me, lots of reading the emails and details about the technology, and that's a pleasant surprise. You go do these hearings sometimes and nobody understands the tech at all. We still had like a couple of please fix my email or my phone for me questions, and like fix my printer or whatever. We still had some of that. But not as much. And I think you did have on both sides some people who, did their homework. What surprised me was, I think part of the way this has been billed was, the big progressive neo-Brandeisian revolution in antitrust, right? Nobody came after the consumer welfare standard. None of the hearing was aimed at demonstrating, extracting evidence, anything around the idea that even if there are problems, can't be redressed by existing law. And that to me is, it's not the function of Congress to go prosecute these cases. The oversight function is, the existing laws working? Are they being enforced? We got very little evidence about, is there a gap between, anti-competitive problems that the current laws can't solve, and what could we do about it? We got none of that, except for maybe a little bit of talk about a little bit of fascination or fetishization about whether the FTC should have brought one merger case, 8 years ago, Facebook, Instagram.
I think that's a really good point, and our previous guests have also made it, is that they did talk about a lot of problems today, problems that I think could be important in a different context. But at their core, they were not antitrust problems. And I think one of the most disappointing things listening to this hearing today was the fact that they kept claiming it was an antitrust problem without going anywhere below the surface level of claiming that it was an antitrust problem, but without explaining why it was an antitrust problem, getting into the nuts and bolts of what actually antitrust is. And it seemed like this was more designed for to put clips on primetime television or make YouTube clips or get on some social media, rather than like really trying to dig at the root causes of the problems that they're trying to discuss and make a case of why these companies deserve antitrust action.
That sounds right to me. I mean, my takeaway was most of the allegations around specific conduct were grievances from rivals, right? They were, Yelp's mad, or, a merchant had a bad experience. And look, some of those things can be issues in other areas of law. You make a promise, you don't keep it. You've got consumer protection law. You steal stuff that's legally protected, and no one even claimed that. Maybe you can have infringement suits or vice versa. It was really individual grievances from specific competitors. And what really jumped off the page to me was if you compare the tone and tenor of the hearing on the Dem side to the sort of academic and public fervor about a big antitrust revolution, there's a big gap. And that jumped off the page to me. None of it was consumer welfare standard is broken. Here's all of this harm to consumers. It was Amazon did stuff that lowered prices and it hurt a rival. Shouldn't we use antitrust law to protect the rival? And the headline to me is, that's not a new antitrust thing. That's 1960s antitrust. That is use antitrust to protect small firms. And there are some in the neo-Brandeisian movement that are very open about this, right? So Matt Stoller, Tim Wu in his book say, if we get higher prices and consumers are made worse off, great. We'll get some more, democracy or something. Maybe, and I view that, obviously, you can maybe hear in my tone, I find that argument unpersuasive. I don't think consumers are getting much, Americans are getting much in that deal, right? And some are open about that. They say, well, we'll get higher prices, but firms will be smaller, and so you'll spend more of your paycheck, getting your groceries, but you'll be happier. I think revealed preference says that that's not what people want. But others in that movement say, would you use existing antitrust law to do a lot more? That requires pointing to evidence of harm, and that just struck me that most of what I heard was no different than what you'd hear in a kind of standard antitrust oversight hearing anytime in the last 20 years. Is, maybe we should use antitrust to help particular competitors whose complaints that we're sympathetic with. And that's not the law, but it's also not a very unique view of the, sort of critics of modern antitrust. It's just sort of the standard debate that's been around for a long time.
Gotcha. So I think for our last question, I want to make it a two-part question, and I want to take advantage of the fact that you're pretty unique in the fact that you have a lot of experiences in academic, publishing, in both legal journals, economics journals, as well as having experience in multiple stints at the FTC at various levels, most recently as a commissioner during the Obama administration. And so I think for people just tuning into this, so for many of our listeners, this is probably the first time they've ever heard an antitrust hearing. Maybe they'd seen headlines about tech and antitrust and potentially companies being broken up, but they don't know very much what's going on. So I think some important context for people that don't know this is that there's also, so this hearing is number 6 in a series of hearings, and there will be a report, and maybe members of Congress will propose new legislation, but there's also ongoing investigations at the Department of Justice at the federal level, ongoing investigations at the FTC into various companies. State attorneys general can also bring cases against companies. In civil court, other companies can bring their own cases as well. So there are many different avenues for antitrust action to occur in a system. So if you could just explain to our listeners how they should be thinking about this hearing in that context. And then the second part of this question is, imagine yourself at the FTC today. If you were a commissioner in office and you were watching this hearing, would it affect you at all? Was there any information that was revealed that would change how you were thinking about these companies? And how does that relate to ongoing investigations at the FTC?
That's great. So with respect to the first question, I do think it's important to keep in mind, and you started some of this, but let me sort of zoom out the picture a little bit. The antitrust ecosystem is a complicated one, right? You have right now there's a big push for states to get more active, and so you had New York State kind of lead the charge in trying to challenge the T-Mobile-Sprint merger. You have Texas leading the charge on a investigation and probable lawsuit against Google. But you've got a big push for states to get a little bit more active in the antitrust world. On top of that, you have current pending investigations, I think about just about every company that was on the panel and more between the FTC and DOJ, right, in various stages. Lots of stories published that, the DOJ has sort of more or less promised that they're going to issue a Google complaint sometime this summer, based on, search ads, whatever, right? But very likely you have a federal suit against one or more of these companies, an active investigation looking back at Facebook, Instagram. Most of the things discussed sort of in pending investigations at the agency, available for states to sue, and frankly, for private plaintiffs too, right? So there can be, class actions in some states and on top of sort of rival suits. So one of the views that I have, and I don't know, this is a view colored somewhat by my experience at the Federal Trade Commission. So when you sit as a commissioner and you have votes on whether to bring particular cases, one of the things that does is everybody who wants you to sue their rival, right? That's if you can get the FTC or DOJ to sue your rival, it's one method of competition, right? And I will say, without naming names, it's a super common method of competition, right? Because it's a lot cheaper than having to sue yourself. You get the FTC to do it. You get a bunch of experts. They go to court. They win some. They lose some, but they win a lot of cases. And so you don't see, Yelp makes its complaints to the FTC or to other agencies all around the world. And sometimes they sue on their own and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they go and they get the FTC or the DOJ to sue. But I promise you, every one of those complaining parties that's sort of a witness for the hearing is inside the DOJ or FTC giving whatever information they have, which colors in part, I think, the second view, which is perspective from the commission standpoint. I can say this now that I left the FTC and I'm not a commissioner. This would not have been a popular thing to say while sitting in that seat. But I think most of the time congressional oversight about specific enforcement actions by agencies is not very welcome, right? It's a bunch of questions from people who they're expert in a lot of things, but antitrust law ain't usually one of them. And there's not really evidence provided. Most of the time the hearings are complaining company is in my district and they want me to shake you down in front of the world and put it on YouTube or the video broadcast service of your choice and, put pressure on the agency. And that's what it's for. And sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not. But I think expectations inside the agency that a hearing like this provides information that is useful to the agencies and that they cannot get on their own approximates zero pretty quickly. Now, what it can do is put pressure on the agency. In this case, the political pressure on the agencies to bring a case or not bring a case is already pretty high. If they don't bring a case, they'll be viewed as asleep behind the wheel. If they bring a case and they lose because they don't have evidence of competitive harm, the laws will be viewed as insufficient. It's, a lot riding on what the agencies do here. It's one of the reasons I thought what Congress could really help with if they wanted to play an active role is helping to muster information about harm to competition, not just rivals, that the agencies don't have. And there just wasn't much of that. So in terms of how I think any of this impacts the agencies, I think very little. And to the extent it does, a little bit of political pressure that, will last a couple of weeks and then it will go away in terms of, hey, we better have our act together, or Congress will ask for briefings on these cases and people from the agencies will show up and have fingers wagged at them about what they're doing or not doing. But the agencies are full of professional antitrust lawyers who know the antitrust law and will bring a case if they've got a good case. If they can come in, and the bottom line is existing antitrust law, if you can prove the defendant's a monopolist and they harmed competition, you're going to win a bunch of cases. And without going into specifics of the individual cases, if you can show the defendant's a monopolist and they harm competition, and you can sort of show the evidence, you'll win. And the agencies know that, and that's what they're looking for. And if they have that evidence, I don't think there's any doubt that either agency will bring a case and will go to federal court. It has long been my view that what modern antitrust law does, the consumer welfare standard, is it sort of cuts out these arguments that are about antitrust and the welfare of a rival or protecting small business or antitrust and democracy or economic inequality. We sort of have a very consumer-focused, consumer-centric view. And if you can show that someone's got monopoly power and they harm consumers, you're going to win. And I think at some point the hearing ends and the politics around it ends and the agencies have subpoena power and get all the data they can. And if they can go to court and show that, they will do so. And they'll win. And if they can't, they'll lose. And that's sort of, I mean, it's the way these areas of law are supposed to work. And I think the way they've worked for a long time, and it'll continue to work. A little bit of added heat and smoke around pressure to bring cases. But besides that, if I were sitting in the FTC today, other than hearing a couple of shots fired about the FTC being asleep behind the wheel about not challenging this merger or not challenging that merger, if I were FTC commissioners, I would probably stand up and defend the agency. But short of that, I don't think anybody over there is losing much sleep over anything that happened today.
All right. Well, on that note, Joshua, thank you so much for coming on and offering your thoughts. I've said this to every guest, and I'll say it to you. Next time there is a hot antitrust debate, we'll have to bring you back to break it down for us. But have a good evening. Thanks for staying up with us.
You too. Take care, guys.
So now we are going to try to get Ramsey one more time.
Fingers crossed.
Cross our fingers that this is going to work. We're going to try to actually give him a phone call. One of those.
Cool. Old tech.
Old tech. We've talked today all about how great tech is, and now we're going to use very old tech. We're actually going to call on Skype, which is kind of awful. All right. Call number. Let's see if this works.
It's always funny to me that phone companies aren't considered tech companies anymore.
Colin Mortimer. Sorry, I had to answer that for Skype.
Come on.
I guess you guys can't hear this on your end, but the phone is ringing.
Which is good.
Which is progress, which means we've connected to something.
That's his voice. We reached his voicemail.
We've reached Ramsey's voicemail. I will not leave him a voicemail. I'll send him a message. We'll chat for a few minutes, and if Ramsey is gone, we can wrap it up. I know it's getting late for normal people right now.
Yeah, and I would love to have Ramsey on because I think, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, Ramsey brings a different perspective to this debate. So he's also a law professor, but he shares kind of the similar goals in terms of social policy like to see enacted across the board. But he tends to be skeptical of the break them up mentality. Like, will that actually help us achieve our goals? And he has a fantastic blog. I highly recommend just Googling his name, Ramsey Woodcock. Read his blog because he's one of the best antitrust bloggers out there and often has a unique take.
Ramsey, great.
Success.
Let's see. All right, let's switch. Let's get you live. All right, can you hear us?
All right. I can hear you.
Awesome. And we're not on a lag anymore.
Great. Well, thank you for your patience. Really appreciate the tech difficulties. This is a new format for us. It's experimental, so we appreciate you playing along. And so we have you as our last guest. I think it's the most prominent, important role. We've had a lot of people talk about details of the hearings, and so for the first question, I'd like to just hear first off the bat, like what your big takeaway from the hearing is, and then we'll get more into specifics that I think are based on your unique insight.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on. This has been a really interesting show and a lot of interesting views here. I guess the hearing didn't reveal, as the other commenters have said, very much. One thing that I've been disappointed about in the debates over antitrust and the resurgence of antitrust into the national conversation is that one hasn't really heard anything new. It seems like the Democrats and sort of New Brandeisian school, their major ambition is simply to get antitrust back to where it was maybe in 1950 or 1955. So it's essentially a retrograde project. And so you don't really hear new ideas coming from that side. And at the same time, the other side doesn't have, since they're simply defending against a project that they already succeeded at interring once, they don't really need to say much that's new. And so you just don't have a productive conversation that's advancing the field at all. And I think that this particular hearing, showed that the level of discourse is even lower than I thought, because as Josh Wright was pointing out, there wasn't even a discussion of the merits of the consumer welfare standard, which is the major, attacking it is supposed to be the major, sort of intellectual project of the New Brandeisians. You don't have any of that. You just, basically have an opportunity for, Democrats to grandstand about concentrated power, whatever that means. I'm still waiting to get a decent definition of what this concentrated power is exactly that they inveigh against. And at the same, and then on the Republican side, I think you see sort of clever opportunism, which is, if the Democrats want to go after four firms that are, completely democratic and liberal in their perspective, you have Google employees organizing against Defense Department contracts. If the Democrats want to go against that, they want to take these bastions of liberalism down, the Republicans are saying, great, we don't like them either, and here's why. So it's just as a progressive, I find the whole thing very sad and dispiriting, because you see sort of progressives attacking progressives, and you see conservatives, making the most of it. So I have no idea where this is all going to go, but I think it was a fairly dark moment.
Go ahead.
So Ramsey, if let's say you're now a member of Congress, you've been elected, you're on the House Subcommittee of Antitrust. What questions would you have asked today to the four tech CEOs who appeared?
That's a good question. I'd be interested in learning more about what Amazon thinks it's doing with, allowing all these, kind of defective or dangerous products onto its website. I'd like to know whether Jeff Bezos thinks in the long run, that doesn't open the company up to serious competitive, threat from some other emerging platform that might be able to provide more protection to consumers, or simply create a disadvantage for Amazon relative to existing retailers that don't do that, right? You've got your Home Depot or your Walmart or what have you, which, selects the brand that it's going to carry and, has worked hard to sort of build a certain amount of reputation with consumers that you're not going to walk into a Home Depot and get a defective product. How Amazon sees itself successfully competing with these companies in the long term if it's building a reputation for itself of selling knockoffs and stolen goods and what have you, right? And that's a really interesting problem. And it's the flip side of this coin that Jeff Bezos kept saying over and over again, hey, look, we didn't have to, we had this big discussion 20 years ago. We didn't have to open our site up. We could have been, a Walmart or a Home Depot and just sort of, pick the products, pick the brands that we sell and sold only for our own account. We decided not to do that. We decided to take this kind of uber competitive, uber libertarian free market approach to our own company. We threw open the door to our own platform And, we think it's successful. And you have to wonder, given where it's going and the fact that evidently all the algorithms and all of the machine learning hasn't been successful at protecting the platform from all kinds of shady third-party dealing, whether he really still thinks that's going to be good for the company in the long term. So I would have been interested in questions about, about the competitive position of this company. And that would have, I think also helped us to answer the question whether this really is a monopoly or just a company which in recent years has been managed rather poorly by a CEO who may be spending his time thinking more about other things. So that would be one for Amazon.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the word platform there a few times, and I think this was brought up in this hearing a few times, but it's been the argument's been most prominently made by Elizabeth Warren, the idea of these are platform companies. This is a new thing where the companies host a lot of economic activity and third-party sellers, in the case of Amazon, or third-party app developers in the case of Apple. But then they're also competitors, right? So Amazon has its own retail business. It has its own private label goods that it manufactures or partners with manufacturers to produce. And then Apple also has apps that it makes and sells or gives away for free in its app store. And I know that you've written a lot about this idea, and also so you've written a series of blog posts I think are excellent, talking about what you think of this concept and whether it's a problem or not, and how that relates to the idea of whether there's too much competition in the market or too little competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the problem that Amazon is suffering from with respect to sort of, defective products being listed and what have you is really too much competition, right? And you have to compare Amazon with a sort of legacy retail model, right, where you've got your Walmart or something which is selling for its own account. It's bringing these brands in. It's not simply letting anyone who wants to sell in a Walmart store to walk in the door with a bunch of products and start hawking them, right? It's not a marketplace. That's the route that Amazon could have taken. And it didn't take that. Instead, it decided to sort of throw open, it's throwing open the Walmart, right, to anybody who wants to walk in. And you're getting competition there, but you're getting very cutthroat competition, right? I mean, you're getting anybody who wants, it's the freest market ever, right? Anyone who wants to walk in can walk in and start selling. And clearly all of the efforts Amazon has been making to keep the shady characters out haven't been completely successful. And that's what you get, right? When you have too much competition, you get low margins, you get people, faking and using sort of unobservables to sell their products and low quality and what have you in order to make a buck. So the question is, do you want an Amazon which has a kind of centrally planned aspect to it, like a Walmart, in which management is deciding who sells in the Walmart and who doesn't, or do you want this sort of free market thing in which I think we're seeing a sort of excess of competition take place, and I think we're seeing the platform really just get away from the ability of management to control it. So yeah, I mean, this is part of the sort of irony of the sort of neo-Brandeisian attacks on the tech giants is, with respect to Amazon at least, and with respect to this product quality issue, it's really, what they're upset about is that there's not enough regulation, right? That there's too much competition that's going on here. But at the same time, I do think it's legitimate for progressives to look at any platform or any firm and say, have you reached a level of size at which, the people who sell on your platform in the market can't go anywhere else and need to be, we need to regulate you, right? I mean, you think about the government of the United States of America, it has a monopoly on the use of force, right? It has a force monopoly, and we all do business on that platform, and we want it regulated because we don't really have anywhere else to go. And so that's why we've got, governance rules and constitutional law and what have you. And so if Amazon were to get big enough that it started to have that state-like character, I mean, it's, obviously we'd want to worry about that and look into it. But my sense is that what's going on here with the attacks on Amazon now are not about that.
So you brought up the R word, regulation, and so I think you've echoed some of our previous guest comments about how you don't see clear antitrust harms here that, if anything, these are problems of too much competition, not too little. But you're not saying that there are no social harms caused by these companies, or that they're, obviously you're not saying they're perfect. And so do you just talk a little more about what you would like to see in terms of regulation, or what kind of government intervention would actually go towards addressing problems and also helping us achieve kind of progressive social goals?
Well, I mean, I think the real issue here is about the distribution of wealth. And progressives have been really frustrated by inequality and by, the increasing divide between rich and poor. And they've been frustrated. I mean, they've been frustrated at the ballot box over and over and over again. You get Republican administrations that, push through tax cuts, and that sort of roll back the redistribution that was going on in the middle of the 20th century. And I think when you're frustrated in getting your tax reform through, you try to look for other means of doing it, right? How else can we redistribute wealth if we can't do it through the income tax system? And, and obviously the way to do that is at the market level through individual markets. And it's only natural to start looking at the major areas of regulation that are capable of doing that. One of them is antitrust, right? So if you've got a firm that has some market power, is able to charge to earn large margins, you say, well, let's go in and drive those margins down. And the neo-Brandeisians have been very explicit about that. There's really a wonderful paper by Phil Longman and Sandeep Faheezan about this, where they come out and they say, look, we should use the antitrust laws to promote competition in markets in which rich people are sort of earning high markups, and in markets in which poor people are suffering from too much competition, we should eliminate that competition and allow prices to rise so that they can benefit. So I think that's really ultimately what the urge is. But the problem, actually progressive economists themselves have pointed out, is if you try to implement these sort of redistributive proposals at the market level by, jiggering around with regulatory regimes which weren't necessarily created for that purpose, you get all kinds of unintended consequences and losses of efficiency and what have you. And so, if the goal is to kind of prevent, Apple from making so much money and minting all these millionaires and billionaires by breaking it up or, by imposing antitrust sanctions on it, you might also lose a company that produces quality products that everybody likes, right? So ideally, you don't want to do that. But I think that at the end of the day is really what's driving this. You see it, I mean, if you are going to do redistribution at the market level, the way to do that is through rate regulation. It's not through antitrust and breakups and messing around with corporate structure. And it was interesting to me the way a lot of the Democrats at this hearing kind of danced around that. It's almost like they don't realize that there's rate regulation and re-regulation out there as an alternative to antitrust. You had Nadler saying, wow, this is just like the railroads 100 years ago. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, and how did we deal with the railroads 100 years ago? We didn't break them up with antitrust. We imposed the Interstate Commerce Commission, right? We regulated railroad rates. So why is that not even in the conversation? It's just such a weird, incoherent moment, I think, on the progressive side with respect to this.
Well, I think that analysis is spot on, and I think you're giving our listeners kind of a perspective on why we're having these hearings, even when all of our experts we have on this show and many experts in mainstream are saying that there's not actually an antitrust problem here. There's not a problem of too little competition. But one of my favorite pieces you've written for your excellent blog was, I believe the title was Writers as a Special Interest. And so if you just explain to our audience the context of what that piece was about, and maybe that could add some color for them about why they see so many headlines in newspapers about breaking up big tech, and so many headlines and so many hearings and politicians who are obsessed with breaking up big tech. So can you just explain that dynamic to our audience?
Yeah. So one of the sort of backstory with part of these hearings is that, there's, the News Media Alliance, which is, a group of sort of media companies and newspapers and what have you, has been pushing for, changes to the antitrust laws, that would allow them to sort of form a cartel and negotiate with Google and Facebook in order to get them, to sort of pay money for content. It's their view that, Google and Facebook make money off these news articles because they get shared on the platform, but they're not paying enough to the newspapers. And behind that really is this sort of deeper issue, which was touched on by a couple of speakers, Nadler, for example, which is, I mean, Google and Facebook, really destroyed the business model for American newspapers. But they didn't do it through anti-competitive behavior. They did it because newspapers had been relying for, centuries on advertising revenue in order to cover the costs of their public interest reporting and what have you. And Google and Facebook came along and they do advertising better than the newspapers. So the newspapers, lost their main source of funding, and they're a powerful interest group too, and they've really been pressing, Congress to do something about that. And look, the newspapers write the news, right? So there's a lot of, if you've seen a ton of articles in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal as well. I mean, News Corp is also part of this. There's zero love lost between Rupert Murdoch and Google and Facebook. They're pushing very, very hard, against these companies because they feel that their livelihood is at stake. And what's the quote? You never underestimate the ability of a man to believe something if his livelihood depends on it. Yeah. So, journalists, I think have really, they've been under threat, and what's happened to them is really horrible. I mean, there's no doubt that capitalism is a brutal system, and you had these jobs and they were secure, and the next thing you're at risk. So I think there's a lot of this has to do with journalists, coming out and giving a platform to, views about antitrust, which were really considered sort of dead and buried, as recently as 5 years ago, and now have been brought back and put into the mainstream. I personally, I'm very much on board with the progressive project of, dealing with wealth inequality, but I'm not sure that antitrust is really the right way to go about doing that.
Well, Professor Woodcock, that's a great note to end on. I think we agree with you on that sentiment, as well as your analysis. And so I just want to thank you again for being patient with us and hanging in there, because I think you were an excellent guest to end on in this new talk show format for us. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for your patience.
All right, have a good night. And with that, I will transition over here and ask you for any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
Any closing thoughts? This was really fun. I want to thank you as a co-host. You built this set. I think this is a fun, exciting thing for the Neoliberal Project, Center for New Liberalism, for PPI, for me as someone who works here, to kind of share ideas, promote great voices and experts that we think are important. And so as a takeaway from the hearing, I think I'll just say that I can't imagine, if you asked me 5 years ago, would you ever watch 6 hours of any congressional hearing? I would have said no. It was entertaining enough. Thank God for Twitter. That makes it bearable. We had an exciting day on the internet. But in terms of where this goes from here, we'll have the report from the majority on the committee imminently, like in less than a month, I believe is the expected timeline of that. Will there be new legislation like we talked about before? There's nothing will move in Congress before the election. So maybe 2021 we'll see movement here. But the action is going to be at the FTC, at the DOJ, and at the State Attorney General. So broaden your horizons if you're trying to follow this debate. Don't look to Congress as your sole source of information or where you think cases might come. But I view all of this as a full employment guarantee for me as an antitrust person, because this is not ending anytime soon. If you're curious about this, spend more time learning about it, because the investment will pay off, because this will be in the news for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is that this is going to be in the news for an incredibly long time. But my prediction is that we're never really going to see dramatic movement on it. I think Dems are really honing on a handful of issues that they're going to focus on if Joe Biden wins, if they take back the Senate, if they keep the House. And antitrust seems like the pet project for a handful of them, but not many of them. I mean, like, even take someone like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders seems really laser focused on economic issues, but he doesn't seem very laser focused on stuff like concentration. Elizabeth Warren is someone who's focused on concentration, but she might end up in Treasury, which she could have some effect on antitrust from there, from a very
banking regulation
kind of thing, but not really. And then there's only a handful of members of the House that really care about this, and I really expect to see more economic stuff come out of like redistribution and new welfare programs and all that kind of stuff, which gets to the point I want to make is like, I think we do this just kind of show and we talk about how all these things are bad and how we shouldn't do all of these things. And it's like, it might come off as like, we don't have a positive vision for like what we want to do to solve these problems. And I think it's like, I think me and you and a lot of the people who joined us today would say, like, look, if you want to tax these companies more, to raise more revenue from them, if you want to tell them or set certain laws to say that they can't do certain behaviors, that's one thing. We're making a very narrow point that, like, just breaking them up, using antitrust, using monopoly laws is just not the appropriate thing. But if you want to tax Amazon higher, if you want to do something, if you want to create a fund for journalism that government gives grants out to newspapers and TV stations that are hurting, like, yeah, that's a whole other different discussion. I think me and you might actually be enthusiastic or at least be open to such an idea. If they want to tax companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google and use that money to create a child tax credit, we're going to be on board with those kinds of things. But then there's a very narrow issue of certain House members and certain senators and certain advocates saying that we need to break these companies up. And our point is that just doesn't solve the problems that they want to solve, and it's actually going to make things worse off for everyday Americans, for everyone, really.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And the only thing I'll add to that is that when my goals as someone who works in public policy full-time, who lives in D.C., is if I'm ever having a debate with someone or, assessing some kind of policy, potential policy, my main goal is to debate the facts, agree on what the set of facts are, what is the law, what would an economic analysis of this particular company or context or what have you. If we can get to the point where we agree on the factual base, but then we say, I have different values than you. Like I might say, I value lower prices for consumers because low prices benefit low-income people the most. And they say, well, actually, like the Green New Deal, climate change, environmentalism, that's my number one issue. And these big companies, if they have a theory that they pollute more or something like that we should break them up because small companies maybe pollute less. Just take an example. And if they say at the end of the day, I'm willing to accept that the way I want to use antitrust to achieve other goals actually ends up harming consumers. And some people in this debate do say that. I think Professor Wright mentioned that. Some of them will say, I'm okay with higher prices for consumers if I get these other goals. And at the end of the day, that's where I want to get in this debate, where it says people recognize there is a trade-off. And we can just talk about different values. The problem is that most of the time it gets bogged down. People say crazy things like breaking them up will be good for consumers, good for workers, good for shareholders. Like it's just like there's no problem, there's no cost to it, there's no potential for error, and that's like the most frustrating part of the debate. So I'm trying to push the ball forward in that sense and help us achieve goals. And I often argue, let's not use antitrust, let's use regulation, let's use taxation, redistribution, strengthen the social safety net, that sort of thing. But that's kind of the conversation I'm trying to have.
And then on that note, I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. But Alec, hey, thank you so much for doing this with me. This is experimental. I'll add that we had technical difficulties like 10 seconds before this began.
Completely my fault.
Completely accident. The wire was just like perfectly behind Caleb. And Caleb, I called you Caleb. Jesus Christ.
That's a compliment. Caleb Watney, great person.
He would have been a fun person to have tonight. Alec just tripped over in the perfect way that broke the wire, so we had to very quickly switch from using a like DSLR camera as our webcam to using an actual webcam.
You made it work though. I'm really impressed.
Somehow it worked. I was trying to fix the wire. It was like broken as shit.
You pulled up Best Buy. You were like gonna run to a Best Buy.
I was gonna like Uber to Best Buy, and Best Buy closes at 6 now. So I was like, webcam. We're just doing a webcam. So if you enjoyed this, and we'll probably do another one of these in the future, I promise next time we will have a functioning DSLR as our webcam. It's going to look great because I was like so excited to show this off. But hey, there's always next time.
Thanks for
and Alec, I only hold a small grudge.
I'll work to remedy it over time.
Have a good night, everyone.